we see our principal strategic goals over the next year and a half revolving really around ensuring that the 2026 election and beyond is free and fair and secure, addressing the extraordinary expansion of presidential power and curbing the abuses of presidential power, and doing something that I think is really critically important, which is building creative and innovative reforms that can actually be solutions to make the country a better place. And we're going to be touching on all of those things. The first thing we're going to talk about has to do with the great constitutional issue of our moment, presidential power, and some really recent developments. I'm going to be joined first by Liza Goitein. She is a director of the Liberty National Security Program here at the Brennan Center and one of the country's leading experts on presidential power and emergency powers. And Liza, this is sort of hot off the presses, as it were. Just in the last few days, we all know that the great constitutional issue right now is what are the limits on presidential power? And there have been some very significant court rulings just within the last week on this. Could you share with our viewers what those are and what we think will come of them?
Absolutely. So what we've seen since January 20th is a pattern of President Trump abusing emergency powers to get around the law and to advance his agenda. And by the way, when I say emergency powers, I'm not just talking about the powers that are available when the president declares a national emergency, but also the powers that he has available to him during war or insurrections or rebellions or other similar types of crises. Government by emergency rule is a feature of authoritarian regimes. In the United States, emergency powers present a real temptation and danger, in part because the courts have traditionally been very reluctant to second guess a president's decision that there is an emergency. But the good news, and it's very good news, is that we are starting to see the courts push back on these abuses. And just in the last week, there were three major, really remarkable victories in this area. I want to say that the Brennan Center was very much involved in all three cases in various ways, largely through submitting and coordinating amicus briefs. The first case was a decision by the Fifth Circuit, which is arguably the most conservative circuit appellate court in the country. And what that court held was that the president could not properly invoke the Alien Enemies Act to deport alleged gang members of the gang Tren to Aragua. The Alien Enemies Act is, of course, a wartime authority that allows the president to summarily detain and deport people who were born in or citizens of the enemy nation. What the Fifth Circuit held was there is no invasion here. There is no predatory incursion because there is no organized armed force. And that this is, in fact, as we knew and as we have long said, a wartime authority. So the next steps are that the government could either appeal this ruling to the Fifth Circuit or the government could go straight to the Supreme Court. So we'll be waiting to see what happens next. In a second case, the Federal Circuit held that President Trump could not use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA, that is a very powerful emergency power, to impose tariffs on almost every country in the world. And what the court said was that the Constitution gives Congress, not the president, the authority to impose tariffs, and that Congress would not have delegated pretty much unlimited tariff authority to the president through a statute that literally doesn't even use the word tariff. The government had...
Let me stop you right there.
Yeah.
This is an extraordinary thing. The two most significant actions taken by President Trump, arguably, in his presidency, is his mass deportation using these emergency powers and the Liberation Day tariffs. We've said, hey, presidents don't have the power to do this on their own without a law, without Congress. And now these two very significant court of appeals have agreed with that. Will this end up at the Supreme Court? The Supreme Court has ducked so many of these issues this year. They have found a way to give President Trump, a lot of what he wants, but not putting their names even on the rulings. They do it through what's called the shadow docket, these kind of often unsigned motions. But this is going to be two really big cases in the full glare of public attention about what the power of the presidency is. And Trump says it'll be a complete economic disaster if his tariffs are blocked by the fact that they're illegal.
Right. And Trump has moved, the administration has asked the Supreme Court to set an extremely expedited briefing and oral argument schedule on the tariffs. The tariffs are actually, the ruling by the Federal Circuit is actually stayed until at least mid-October. So actually the plaintiffs have an incentive also to get a quick resolution from the Supreme Court. And so they are not opposing this motion for expedited review. So we might see oral argument with all the briefing all done, and we might see oral argument in this case as early November. And so we could have a ruling from the Supreme Court very soon. The Supreme Court can't duck this one. I mean, I suppose it could choose to, but that seems very, very unlikely. All of the sort of emergency appeals and all of that, they're off the table because this ruling doesn't go into effect anyway.
Michael McConnell, the conservative former federal appeals federal judge, says he thinks this is going to be the biggest case on presidential power since the case about whether President Harry Truman could seize the steel mills during the Korean War. The third big case of the last week has to do with the other really demonstrative, provocative, authoritarian move that the president has made this summer, which was the deployment of troops, first in Los Angeles and then in Washington, D.C. Why don't you tell us about the case? And also more broadly, is all this use of these troops legal?
We don't think so. We believe that it is illegal, that it was illegal in Los Angeles. It is illegal in DC. It would be illegal in Chicago or other cities. At a minimum, it violates the principle and tradition that goes back to the founding of this nation against using the military for law enforcement purposes. And that principle is absolutely vital to democracy and to individual liberty, because if the president can just turn the army inward against the people of this country, that can very easily become an instrument of oppression and tyranny. That principle is enshrined in the Posse Comitatus Act. And earlier this week, a district court judge in San Francisco held that the Marines and the federalized National Guard troops that were deployed in Los Angeles had in fact violated the Posse Comitatus Act and enjoined them from continuing the activities that violated the law. This is the first time that a court has issued an injunction against Posse Comitatus Act violations. And to issue the injunction, the court had to reject the government's argument that the only remedy for a Posse Comitatus Act violation is for the administration to bring criminal charges against itself. So fortunately, that argument was rejected. Now, obviously in DC, or not obviously, but the law in DC is a little bit different because the president has command and control over the DC National Guard at all times. And the Department of Justice has taken the position that DC National Guard isn't subject to the Posse Comitatus Act unless it is formally called into federal service, which is something the president doesn't have to do because he already has command and control. We think there are strong legal arguments against that. And just today, the DC Attorney General filed a lawsuit against the administration based on these deployments of the National Guard.
And so, you know, in Los Angeles, arguably, but not really, they were defending federal actions, federal buildings. In DC, they have all this power because this is why DC ought to be a state, among other reasons. But they are threatening to send troops to Chicago to fight crime. And now Chicago has a pretty serious crime problem. But it seems, as Governor J.B. Pritzker has said, that it would be an extraordinarily provocative thing to send the Texas National Guard into Chicago to engage in crime fighting. What do you think is going to happen there? And would courts block that as well?
Yeah, the only way for the president to constitutionally send the Texas National Guard into Illinois would be to federalize the Texas National Guard. This is not a situation, unlike DC, where state governors can send their National Guard forces into the DC, even if the mayor objects, as long as the president has requested it. That's not the case when a governor tries to send guard troops into another state, because under our Constitution, states are sovereign entities vis-a-vis one another. One state can't just invade another. So he would have to federalize the National Guard in Texas, and that means he needs federal authority to do it. He has to point to a statute. And we would argue that there is no federal law right now that could be properly interpreted to authorize deploying troops, federalized National Guard troops in Chicago for purposes of local crime control.
So, these are really big issues, as you know, in the heart of what it means to have a democracy in this country. If you look at the notes for the Constitutional Convention and the ratifying conventions too, this question of whether the president would march the militia from one state into another was something they worried about a lot. It's actually one of the reasons they have the Second Amendment, to keep the state militias strong. It's a major moment in the history of the country that we're even having to think about this. Don't go anywhere, Liza. I know folks will have questions for you. As I've said, the other major set of issues that the Brennan Center has focused on more than anything else in recent years, which I think probably most of you who are joining us know, is to make sure that our elections are free and fair and safe and secure. Wendy Weiser is our Vice President for Democracy, one of the country's leading experts on voting. And, look, Wendy, in 2020, 2022, 2024, American elections were under enormous pressure. COVID, of course, but threats of violence, lies, all these other things. And they actually held it together pretty well. The elections actually were effectively safe and secure. But we think there's some new factors here that give us a great deal of concern that we've been documenting and seeing more and more clearly this summer. Why don't you share what that is as you're looking at this?
So we have had a lot of pressures on our elections in the last couple of years, and it's been increasing. But what is really alarming and new this year, that we haven't seen in other years, is that the federal government has now emerged as one of the principal antagonists and threats to free and fair elections. We are seeing, and we have documented in not only a recent two reports that we've put out, but also in some litigations, a systematic set of actions that are being taken by the Trump administration to take control of or undermine federal elections. The two most prominent things that folks might be aware of is an executive order that the president issued in March, trying to change election law by himself, by decree, essentially decreeing that all Americans should have to show a passport or a similar document in order to register to vote using the federal voter registration form. He tried to decertify all voting machines, order those to be, or most of the voting machines used across the country, to give Elon Musk's Doge and the Department of Homeland Security unfettered access to sensitive voter information. All of this by presidential fiat. And
wait a minute, they wanted to order states to give the voter data to Doge. Let that sink in, because what could go wrong with that?
What could go wrong indeed? And I will say that the president doesn't have the authority to do any of this, and I'll get to that punchline. But there are multiple ways, not just with this executive order, that they are trying to pursue these aims. And so they are still trying to pursue these voter data using the Department of Justice and many other means, which I will get to in a moment. But the president has been claiming an extraordinary authority over that. The president has the authority to control elections, federal elections in the country. And that is exactly backwards, the exact opposite of what the Constitution requires. The Constitution, in our system, it's the states that run elections, not the federal government. And the Constitution gives authority to set election rules to the states and to Congress. The president has no lawful role in that scheme. And yet the current president is actually claiming that not only does he have the authority to unilaterally set those rules by himself, but that the states are merely his agents and they have to do what he says when it comes to elections.
And you're not exaggerating. He actually said the states are merely agents.
Those are the exact
in a
words.
different Truth Social post about a different supposed executive order that he never did.
Yeah.
But, it's an extraordinary thing. We've never had a president try to take personal control over the election system in the country. And of course, given all the ways in which Trump has tried to overthrow the last election and spread all these sort of conspiracy theories about elections, that's particularly troubling, right?
Absolutely. And I will say that last time there was an attempt to overturn the election, it was a little bit more slapdash and put together at the last minute. This effort has started on day one of this administration. The very first act that the president, on the very first day, the president pardoned those that were convicted of crimes on January 6th. This executive order was issued in March, and there's been a systematic populating of high ranks of federal offices with people who were deeply involved in the effort to overturn the election and who are now claiming authorities over the election process and tilting the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and other federal offices in the direction of those aims.
So, we've really been able this summer to connect the dots. Some of these things are big public things like an executive order. Others are kind of more quiet. There are a lot of things people might not know about. They fired and purged the election security experts in the federal government. They're threatening to use criminal prosecutions against election officials to scare them, to chill them, to maybe put pressure on them. If you think about, if someone tries to get them to overturn the result. One of the best regarded election security officials in the last Trump administration was a guy named Chris Krebs. And there's actually an executive order ordering an investigation of him for the temerity to say that the last presidential election of that year, was free and fair and not stolen. There are a bunch of these other things. How do we see this playing out? Are there actions the federal government is going to take in coming months that we can expect to see unfold? And also, what can states and election officials do to protect themselves?
Well, there's actions that are unfolding right now. Right now, the Department of Justice is actually actively pursuing the voter files, all the sensitive voter information from states across the country. Just yesterday, there was a report that they're pursuing voting machines from Missouri. They've already asked for all the voting machines in Colorado. So they are actively, currently, in increasingly aggressive and threatening ways, trying to get access to that. What are they going to do with that? What are some of the other things we expect? We should be expecting imminently false and misleading claims about non-citizen voting coming out of these efforts to grab the voter rolls or to or out of these different federal agencies that are claiming that they're doing investigations. Misleading government reports about the security of our election equipment. We're seeing aggressive efforts to demonize and delegitimize the election equipment that they use so that they can be more easily challenged, or maybe, worse, that they could be used for pretext for interference. The politicized investigations and prosecutions is a real concern, and election officials across the country have said that they are worried. These are not idle concerns. They have been made very expressly and publicly, not only in Project 2025, but by the president and the administration officials themselves. And so that is very intimidating and something that is that we can expect to escalate. So those are just some of the things. I'm also very worried with the increased and new claims of a federal authority over vote counting and vote tabulation, which is something brand new that just came up that we've just started hearing recently, that we're going to see increasing efforts to seize election equipment, to try to overturn elections, or to even mobilize or remove officials.
So this was our restful summer, was dealing with all of this. And don't go away. We've got audience questions for you and the others. One of the things coming up in the coming weeks are the elections for governor and other offices in states, including New Jersey and Virginia. And we'll keep our eyes open about whether there are going to be test runs of some of these intimidation tactics. Already we saw in Los Angeles when Governor Newsom was announcing the redistricting initiative there, ICE agents massed in front of the political event, purely coincidentally, supposedly. But it's a way in which these things all can kind of fuse together, not to change the votes, but to shake up people's confidence. Hernan, let's see, what are we going to be doing now? Well, we're going to be talking about redistricting, because when you think about the ways in which the rules of the election are going to be set in a way that could make it harder for people's voices to be heard. The way redistricting happens in this country, gerrymandering, has all been a problem. And we all think that, voters should choose their leaders and not the other way around. But redistricting happens every 10 years when the census is conducted. That is not the case right now. And why don't we bring in Kareem Creighton? Dr. Kareem Creighton is our vice president for Washington, D.C. We met him. There was a little bit of noise there, so we're going to see. Kareem, are you able to tell us about what's going on in Texas, where everything is bigger in Texas?
I'll do my best, Michael, and apologies. It seems we've got some appliances going on outside of this space for a while. But
I could come back to you in a minute if you want.
That seems right. Why don't we do that?
See, this is live Zoom. This is great. Okay, let's see what else we got. Well, L.B. Eisen, Lauren Brooke Eisen is the director of our justice program, and can follow up in a sense on some of the things we've been talking about, and some of the things Liza Goiting was talking about when it comes to the future of how federal law enforcement and federal forces are going to be built out in a rather disturbing way in this country. That may make the deployment of National Guard forces to stand in front of the National Air and Space Museum look quaint. The big budget bill that passed had as one of its provisions an extraordinary expansion of funding for ICE and for other immigration-related agencies. You've been looking at this, and you've been looking at how the money is going to be spent. First of all, give us a sense of just the size of the growth of funding for these particular law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, so Michael, this so-called One Big Beautiful Bill allocates more than $170 billion over 4 years for border and interior enforcement, with the goal of deporting 1 million immigrants a year. And breaking it down further, through this law, Congress gave ICE $75 billion over 4 years. That translates into about $18.7 billion each year, despite ICE's budget already rapidly increasing over the last few years. The legislation makes ICE the largest federal law enforcement agency. That's bigger than the FBI, bigger than the DEA, giving it, through this bill, $45 billion to build new detention centers. And that's on top of $14 billion for deportation operations. In terms of what this looks like compared to other budgets, putting these dollars into perspective, the New York City Police Department's budget for fiscal year 2025 is about $5.8 billion. This is more than the entire state of Florida spends to operate its schools each year. And the new funds could lead to a doubling of detention capacity. The Washington Post recently obtained internal ICE documents indicating that ICE should have the capacity to hold more than 100,000 people by January of next year. And what's really important to understand is that this bill has codified much of his immigration agenda, drastically changing the landscape of enforcement and detention. And it's going to be very, very difficult to unwind this giant immigration detention apparatus. Very difficult to dismantle under future administrations.
I've seen one fact that viewed as a military force, it would be behind the Chinese army and the U.S. Army, basically, is the largest military force in the world in terms of numbers of people, which seems extraordinary if true. How we obviously we have immigration laws and we have had deportations before. What's particularly troubling about this roided up version of ICE that is being built? One of the elements of it is it seems to be so ideologically constructed that the motto for it is defend the homeland. It seems very much a political project, but I know, have concerns about the way people are being hired and the training and the protections for constitutional and individual rights that might not be fully protected under this approach.
Yeah, you mentioned how quickly this is happening and this incredibly historic ramp up. And there has been this rapid funding surge, and there's a real concern about how 10,000 new ICE employees are going to be able to receive proper training. ICE currently has about 5,700 deportation officers, and the administration wants to add about 8,000. So that's 8,000 more deportation officers by the end of the year. And what's very troubling is that we've started to see the administration cutting corners on the training and vetting that's needed to hire and train deportation officers. So right now we know that ICE is eliminating its age restrictions for all new applicants as the agency seeks to hire these new officers. Previously, recruits had to be 21, now they can be 18. In a very frightening development, ICE used to provide much more training. So they provided about 5 months of federal law enforcement training. Now newly recruited ICE deportation officers will receive about half of that training. The Atlantic just reported that it's partly by eliminating Spanish language courses. And we know that this unprecedented funding is really going to bolster the administration's anti-immigration agenda. And the danger here is that we are building a deportation complex with officers who are just not trained. We're building capacity really, really quickly. Much of that capacity is being built by private prisons. We can talk about that in a minute. And, getting back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, hiring this many officers, hiring them this quickly is creating an infrastructure that will be very, very difficult to dismantle in future presidential administrations. And there are also real concerns about what conditions of confinement will look like inside these detention centers. We know that there are already lawsuits across the country about conditions of confinement, how detainees are being treated. And remember, these are civil detainees. These are people who are in civil detention centers. And we know that because these detention centers are growing so quickly, so many new ones are being brought online, that there are real questions about overcrowding and what the conditions in these facilities will look like.
And as you said, LB, you are the author of the book Inside Private Prisons, which is one of the definitive books on that topic. You're not against the existence of all private prisons, but this is a growth model for them. And there's every reason to think they're cutting corners and that this is, again, these are not hardened murderers here. These are people being detained for immigration matters. Do you think that there's fertile ground to be looking at the nature of these facilities and the private way they're operated?
Well, more than 90% of people in immigration detention are housed in facilities owned or managed by for-profit companies, by these private prisons. And, for years, these corporations have been an important partner for ICE as the government has delegated its authority to manage and run these facilities to these contractors. The two biggest private prison companies in the U.S., CoreCivic and Geo Group, are publicly traded, and they've taken incredible steps this year to increase their detention capacity. They've signed contracts with the federal government to add additional beds to current detention facilities, and they've signed dozens of new contracts with the federal government to open so-called idle facilities that went offline, that are not being used. They might have been prisons, federal prisons before, but they were shuttered in recent years. So they're bringing all these prisons back online, making them detention centers. And, Geo Group, one of these companies, recently told investors that they've seen a huge increase in revenue. They just reported out their second quarter revenue of more than $636 million, which is a 5% increase over the same time period last year. And CoreCivic recently reported out more than $538 million during the company's second quarter. And that's an almost 10% increase from the same time period in 2024. We're likely going to see those profits significantly rise. And what's really important here to know is that it's happening very, very quickly. And there's a real worry about how you're going to train people quickly enough and what the conditions are going to look like when you're just adding beds to existing facilities.
So that's something we will be keeping our eyes on. And now I think we've fixed the technical problems. Thank you, LB. I think we've fixed the technical problems with Kareem Creighton, or at least I hope so.
They're fixed.
Kareem, we've had gerrymandering for a long time in this country. Redistricting has always been very political. But what I think most of the folks on this program who are watching know is that what's going on in Texas has been really unusual. Why is it so extraordinary? And what has been the response from Democrats around the country?
Sure. It is unusual even for gerrymandering, in part because Texas, which has done mid-decade redistricting or gerrymandering in the past, is essentially saying this time, well, we gerrymandered before, but we think there's more gerrymandering to do. And not only that, it's not doing it at the behest of a fellow Texan. They're taking phone calls from Washington, D.C. And in those two different ways, in particular, I'll be specific about it, the President of the United States, by most reports, called up members of the Texas legislature and said, can you find me some more seats in Congress? And apparently Texans, who typically are very insular about Texans doing Texas things, said, we're happy to oblige. So what makes this really peculiar is Texas is going back to the well to redraw maps, all in search of an additional 5 seats. Texas has about 38 congressional seats. Right now, there are 13 Democrats. They sat down and redrew the maps in a special session. And the maps that they have created takes 5 seats that were held by Democrats and made them reshape the entire state, but reshaped it in a way that likely added 5 of those seats to the Republican column, such that there will likely be, if the election is at all similar to what past elections are in terms of votes, 7 Democratic seats, and again, 5 plus the difference in Republican seats. And that was all in pursuit of adding more to the Republican ledger. Democrats in the legislature in Texas did what they could by leaving the state. They eventually came back, allowed the map to go forward. But of course, they weren't the only Democrats who were upset about this outcome. You probably have heard about Gavin Newsom in California, the governor of that state, looked at this and said, well, we don't think one state should be driving all of the action in the national government. And so California, which has a different process for drawing its maps, it relies on an independent commission to draw its maps. California said, well, we're jumping into the pool as well. We're going to take 5 seats that currently are held by Republicans in their congressional map. They have 52 congressional districts, and they're going to go back to the map and essentially nullify those additional 5 seats that the Republicans picked up.
They're actually having to go to because they have this independent redistricting commission, which the Brennan Center has supported and helped to pass and create. They have to go to the voters in November. It's going to be a very big deal, and it's going to cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And they're going to try to persuade California voters to pass a new map with more Democratic seats to respond to the new gerrymandered map in Texas. And but Democrats don't have so many options in so many other states to respond in that way. I mean, Illinois, for example, already has squeezed about as many Democratic seats, I think, as it's possible to humanly squeeze. What we've said is that ultimately a partisan arms race on this can't be the ultimate answer. There has to be a national standard that applies to red states and blue states alike. And the Supreme Court blew it in cases including
Common Cause versus Rucho, yeah.
And, where they just refused to police partisan gerrymandering. And Congress came really close to passing a national ban on mid-decade redistricting and national redistricting standards in the Freedom to Vote Act in 2022. It came very close. And ultimately, congressional action like that has to be part of the answer. But there's something, as I know you're looking at very intensely, there's something beyond just this partisan gerrymandering war at play here, which is the Voting Rights Act. That same Supreme Court that walked away from its duty to police partisan gerrymandering looks like it could be poised to do some real damage to the laws that protect against racial discrimination in drawing election districts. This is like a little cloud on the horizon that's going to get bigger and bigger as it comes toward us. Could you tell us what we're seeing happen in the courts and what we think will come next on that?
Sure. Well, there are a few different ways in which people have attacked the Voting Rights Act, a really key piece of legislation that has helped minority voters, in particular racial minorities, assure that the election process is fair and equal. And in particular, where redistricting is concerned, that maps fairly reflect those communities. And what we've seen, at least in the last few days, is the United States Supreme Court decide that it wanted to rehear a case that had been heard by the court last term on this question as to whether or not Section 2 should even be considered constitutional. That wasn't on the books in the last argument, but all of a sudden this court said, well, we want to hear our arguments on this question. So
that's really chilling. Tell folks what Section 2 is.
Sure. So Section 2 is a provision of the Voting Rights Act that essentially says to voters, look, if you have a system or map that is not treating you in a way that like fully reflects your opportunity to cast a ballot, either by putting you too heavily in a district or not, giving your community an opportunity to have multiple districts where you can have an opportunity to elect a candidate, you can go to court. You can go to court, you can sue and force the jurisdiction if you make an evidentiary finding to redo its maps in this case. And here, what we're hearing from the state of Louisiana is saying to the Supreme Court, upon being invited to answer questions about the constitutionality of Section 2, they say, well, look, we don't think it's constitutional and you should get rid of it. Now, mind you, they say, well, this consideration of race is just really a bad thing. It is not consistent with the way the colorblind constitution should work. I'll just remind people, Louisiana was the state that gave us Plessy versus Ferguson, this case that originated much of what we see in Jim Crow, which made the Voting Rights Act necessary. So that's where we're really trying to fight now to convince the court that a decision we thought was pretty much quite clear, that fighting discrimination in the election system was a good thing. We're trying to convince them now that absolutely that's what the Constitution stands for. And we're going to show, as we have in an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief we just submitted, show them all the different ways in which local jurisdictions, counties, school boards, county commissions, city councils have all benefited from the application of Section 2. So it would be a really bad idea to get rid of it. I should mention one case that's seminal in the way in which Section 2 has been interpreted was authored by Justice Brennan, for whom the center is named. So this really represents a legacy of really realizing the full breadth of what democracy means to people, including people of color.
Well, we will be fighting on these fights and doing everything we can to preserve what's left of the Voting Rights Act, even as we work to enact other legislation to modernize our election system. Stick around. I know folks have questions. As I said at the start, we view our role as being to help craft new solutions. There's clearly a great hunger for change in the country. and for not just doing things the old way. There's always been corruption in our country. There's always been a lot of money flying around politics, but things are really different now than they've been, I would argue, ever. And Dan Weiner is director of our Elections and Government program based out of Washington, D.C. And you've written about this in Time magazine this summer. You know, we almost don't have the language to describe the kind of corruption we're seeing. The world's richest man paying for the winning presidential campaign, then literally moving into the White House on a cot and being given for a few months before it all went crazy, effectively prime ministerial authority to illegally dismantle a lot of the federal government. That's kind of not, you know, your typical paid for play, you know, stuff. How should we understand this moment, and what kinds of things should we be thinking about doing about it?
Yeah, well, it's a great point, Michael, and it is something that we've written about. I think that it is always important, right? You start with, you don't want to exceptionalize everything to such a degree, right? We've had corruption in this country before. We had Clinton era scandals. We've had, you know, there were scandals under President Biden, but it's different right now, right? And there are a couple ways that it is. I think that the thing that probably we see the most in the news and is the most important to think about, right, is just the scale of the high level corruption we're seeing right now. Other presidents have had scandals, but just the amount of self-dealing at the very top. You know, I think of the president's family's crypto business, right, which is netting billions of dollars. At least a significant chunk of that is coming from overseas in the Middle East and elsewhere. And that is coupled, frankly, also with the trend towards unbridled presidential power that LB and Liza talked about, right? Because you've got all these companies now trying to get in on the game of these presidential actions. That also creates opportunities for corruption. But then you also have, as we've said, you have a broken campaign finance system, a system that basically all contemporary regulation has been dismantled. Trump was the first president to really truly outsource major swaths of his campaign to super PACs funded by Musk and others. And that then, you know, those people were turned loose on the government. Musk is gone, but actually there's still other people in government who are still making policy, including in areas where they have large personal financial interests.
So what's so interesting, because, you know, we think, well, in the old days, you think of Tammany Hall, a lot of people were lining their pockets in government. But then in the late 20th century, the notion was, well, that kind of old-fashioned corruption really wasn't the problem. It was more the systematic corruption of dark money, big money, and that sort of thing. We've now seen a return to the self-enrichment in government, and again, in a way that was unthinkable a few years ago, but is also at a far greater scale than Teapot Dome or
right.
Mobilier or these other scandals throughout American history. What can be done about these things? It's interesting because the Democrats, for example, as they're casting about for their response to all of this, have said, according to Politico, rather the Washington Post, that taking on corruption is actually a big issue for them, they think, in the campaign. But if that's true, what kinds of things should they be looking at?
Well, I think that it's a great question. And I think that where you start with is that most Americans don't realize to what degree a lot of the sort of standards and assumptions that we had following Watergate and following the progressive era still amounted to an honor system, basically, for the folks at the very top. Jimmy Carter, you know, sold his peanut farm because he thought it was the right thing to do. And so the question is, we need new rules that can embody this sense of public service as a public trust, including for those at the very top, and that apply evenly. What does that mean? I don't think it means vast new codes of regulations. I think it means clear rules that apply to everyone, and critically that are enforced evenly, because I think that so many of our problems in this country actually come down not just to whether there's a rule or not, but do we have clear, robust, even-handed enforcement? The other thing I just think we have to mention here, of course, is overhauling our campaign finance system. We have to confront the legacy of Citizens United. One last thing then that we haven't talked about, but is the role of big tech consolidation. Musk isn't just any billionaire. He runs a giant social media platform that can be used obviously for nakedly partisan purposes, but it is also about how, frankly, we interact with each other and how the attention economy is run. And I think that that is going to be something else that Congress and policymakers need to confront.
I mean, I think as we're looking at this, we need to think broadly and widely about what the problems are and what the solutions are. Everything from Supreme Court term limits to constitutional amendments to address Buckley v. Vallejo, the original really bad Supreme Court case on campaign finance. We need to think as big as the problems are in looking at how we address them, and also relating to tech and how tech can be brought into some sense of accountability.
And we need to remember that there is a lot of bipartisan frustration and desire for change out in the country, whatever happens in Washington. And I think that whoever can harness that, right, truly harness it, right, can drive a really transformative agenda. But that is going to be the challenge, is summoning that sort of political will to actually do what I think the American people want people to do, which is come up with kind of bold solutions to these problems.
Well, because as we all know, people care a lot about this, but they're very skeptical of politicians of any party. And they think they all have their hand in the till, and nobody's going to do anything about it, and they're all kind of the same. And I think that anybody who can break out of that and actually not just talk about democracy abstractly, but actually show what could be done to improve it, will have the potential to change that view. But until then, it's going to be very hard. Do stick around. The last person we're going to hear from is Hernandez Stroud. He is a senior fellow in our justice program. And as I said, we work for solutions, and he's been very involved in something that's very encouraging in New York City, but with implications for the wider criminal justice reform effort. Hernandez, why don't you start by telling the folks who are not from New York City, what is Rikers Island?
Sure. So Rikers Island is a complex of jails. It's a collection of about 10 jails that sit on an island that is far removed, although it's visible if you're at LaGuardia Airport. And it has a reputation for violence. There are assaults. Just last night, hours ago, someone died. And in the past 12 days, there have been 3 deaths. Since 2015, there have been about 120 deaths. And so it is a pretrial institution, meaning that most people there have not been charged with any sort of criminal offense, and they are simply there awaiting their day in court. And there's also a backlog of people who are waiting to get transferred to prison here in New York State. And there's a backlog because of the strike that happened among some of the prison guards earlier in the year.
So it's kind of a hellhole. It's a big, institutionally, it is a terrible mess. And people have been trying to close it for years. People have been trying to reform it for years. And none of these efforts by the government seem to work out very well. What has happened in the courts, and you've been a proponent of this, that gives some possibility of some improvement there?
Sure. So back in 2011, a dozen incarcerated people filed suit against the city, arguing that they had been victims of this excessive force and violence, specifically at the hands of corrections officers. And they asked the city to make changes to how it jails people, to reduce that violence, to reduce that excessive force. So the city said, instead of going to trial, we'll agree to make a number of changes that are addressing those concerns. They would focus on staffing, how staff are deployed. Part of the problem is that staff a lot of times aren't in critical posts where violence can ensue. It would focus on management. It would focus on accountability. Part of the problem is that there's not a great deal of accountability for problems that happen among the staff. And so the city agreed to make all of these changes under the gavel of a federal judge. So they agreed to a consent decree. And essentially, over the past decade, that was back in 2015, the city, Judge Swain, who is the presiding judge over the consent decree, basically found that the city hasn't done much of anything to reduce violence, to improve conditions. And so what's a court to do when the government won't run a public institution in compliance with its legal obligations? Courts have numerous things, and this goes all the way back to Brown against Board of Education, when the courts were struggling with local school systems, segregationist school systems, to bring those school systems into compliance with Brown, to desegregate. And judges there eventually got around to issuing compulsory orders. And one of those things that they tried was receivership. And judges saw some results with that. And then it spread to other institutional settings, jails and prisons among them. And to make this short, receivership is basically the idea of someone coming in to an institution who works for the courts, who's answerable only to the courts, and their sole job is to focus on getting rid of these unconstitutional conditions, often that have political solutions. And so to give one example, if the solution for Rikers is changing the union agreements that dictate how much freedom employees get, how little accountability there is, then that might be one thing where the city wasn't willing to do that politically, but a receiver unbounded by politics, answerable only to the courts, would be able to do something about that.
That's really encouraging, and it's not usually the case that we think that a judge taking over a big institution is the right answer. And as you've said, thinking about school desegregation in places like Boston, it was a political morass, even if necessary. But in this instance, when the political system is so stuck, it could really make a difference. And it's part of the array of innovations that I think are unfolding all over the country. And we need to be looking for these shafts of light to give us a sense of kind of the path beyond this. And as we're asking people in politics to stand up and speak out for reform. I have a question for all the folks here. And so we are running out of time, but we can pull up everybody so everyone can see each other. This is something our audience asks all the time. At a time of potential hopelessness, what is one thing that our audience can take away from this conversation that they can do or that needs to be done in coming months? And I'll start with you, Wendy.
So it is a trying time, but I don't think we should succumb to despondency, because there are checks and balances in place. They will not work if the American people, if all of us don't stand up to uphold them. There are elected officials, there are courts, there are law enforcement officials, there are all sorts of good people around the country who want to uphold democracy, rule of law, check abuse of power. They need our support to do so. Ultimately, we need to also look to the future. We need to make sure that we have national legislation and that we are working now to lay the foundation to protect elections, democracy, abuse of power, corruption. We can actually right this ship.
Thank you, Wendy. Let's see. How about Kareem? What can you tell our audience to take away from this moment?
You mentioned earlier, Michael, that this year, this November, there are going to be these things we still have in this country called elections. All of the solutions that we've been talking about and the issues are all being done in the name of the American people, and they only continue to be done if we choose to allow them. So I would say the one thing that we all can do, both for those who are having elections in November 2025, but certainly November 2026, which is a midterm year. We're having basically, our Congress and a lot of different state governments up for election. The whole question about gerrymandering is about to get is intended to get in the way of the will of the people. But you make it easy if you don't show up and vote. So I would say more than anything, despite the assaults on the right to vote, voting in this country remains the most powerful thing that any individual can do to affect change. And so if we want to get to solutions, the first order of business is to show up and vote.
Thank you. How about you, Liza Goitein?
Yeah. And I would say between now and your next chance to vote, obviously we put a lot of emphasis on Congress and the courts for obvious reason, but public opinion matters too. It matters to this administration. If something is hugely unpopular, that matters. Certainly if the markets are tanking, that matters. And so that means that you can have an effect by making your voices heard, by writing letters to the editor. I feel like I'm dating myself. So maybe posting on social media.
What's an editor?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about, but yes, but making your voice heard in the way that people do today, and going to protests peacefully, protesting. We don't want to create any excuses. Not that there will need to be an excuse, but for further military deployments, making your voices heard. I think there may be a sort of feeling that why bother, that's not going to be effective. And certainly in the short term, when the numbers are smaller, when the president is able to deploy troops, it may feel that way. What he did in Los Angeles was unpopular. What he's doing now in DC is unpopular. If that public pressure builds, I believe it will be meaningful. So make your voices heard.
Lauren Eisen.
Yeah, I think that we have to increase oversight of our detention centers in this country. Congress has previously considered ways to expand oversight and transparency of detention facilities, specifically of prisons and detention centers operated by corporations. There is legislation, the Private Prison Information Act, that would increase the information private prisons these companies have to make public. It would improve transparency in these detention centers. It did not advance last year. Additionally, there are models within states. So for example, while state oversight of ICE detention is incredibly limited, oversight of these facilities has traditionally lived with DHS and the Government Accountability Office, but California offers a model for states to follow as oversight is reduced in this country. And we've seen in California, there is a law the state legislature passed that requires their state's California Department of Justice to review and report on conditions of confinement in immigration detention facilities. And the state has released multiple reports about conditions in immigration detention centers in the state, all of which I believe are private. So we really have to think about ways that not just the federal government, but also states can help to provide really important transparency and oversight of detention centers in this country, especially as we significantly increase the number of people who are going to be in these places.
Thank you. Hernandez.
Sure. So this question takes me back to something that Justice Kennedy wrote and then Justice Brennan also alluded to, which is the nature of how we think about jails and prisons in this country, which is that pretty much, they're out of sight, out of mind. When someone gets hauled off to prison or jail, they're out of sight. And I think that for people in the public, it would be great for people to realize that almost 95% of people behind bars will return to society. And so all of that dysfunction that exists within these closed institutions that we don't see will affect our communities, will affect us. And so this receivership question and dilemma goes to, I think, a sort of age-old question for democracy, which is how does society protect people at the margins of society from the base impulses of the majority? And so I think that people have to care, even though people aren't getting elected in New York City, at least not right now, based on how well they run Rikers. Maybe that's something that should change.
Thank you. And finally, Dan Weiner, take us home. What should the audience take away from this conversation? You are on mute.
Oh, sorry about that. You gave me a tough job, and I agree with everything my colleagues have said. So in very short, I think that we ultimately need to think about not only how do we deal with these incredible challenges for our democracy, but how we got here. And why is it that authoritarian politics are frankly so appealing to some of our fellow citizens? And my personal view is that we need a new commitment to an ideal of government that folks can believe in and an ideal of public service and the public trust. And ultimately, what I would say to ordinary people and everyone is that we need to demand that from elected officials and those in power, because we can't just revert to some sort of status quo circa whenever. This has got to be a new commitment to a government that really works for all Americans and that can get us the politics that frankly we all deserve and we want to pass on to our kids.
Eloquent and for the ages. Thank you. Thank you to all of my colleagues. I am reminded in a conversation like this how lucky I am and how exciting it is to work with all of you and with the other committed and really brilliant people here at the Brennan Center. Thank you to everybody for watching. We hope you'll join us for future Brennan Center live events to be kept fully up to date about the upcoming schedule. Please make sure you look at our events newsletter at brennancenter.org/events. Thank you to everybody who's with us, and we expect a busy fall to come. Thanks so much.